Shirin Neshat, it's a great pleasure for me to be here at the Goodman Gallery in London with you. We are both women of Iran. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. The honor is mine.
In a talk you gave a number of years ago, I think might have even been a decade ago, you said, the women of Iran historically seem to embody political transformation. By studying a woman, you can read the structure and the ideology of the country. Now, that could not be more true when we look at what's happening in our country today. The women of our country are leading a revolution by refusing to wear the veil. Once again, the veil seems to be at the center. Can you talk a little bit about this overlap of women and politics in Iran, and maybe talk a little about how the Women of Allah series that you did is relevant today?
First of all, I have to explain that everything that I've done to date is from the point of view of an Iranian who's living on the outside, especially in exile. So it has this almost sociological angle to it. And you have to remember that when I left Iran in the late 1970s, Iran was ruled by the Shah. So this was the impression I left with. But then when I returned in 1990, now it was the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so my Woman of Allah was, it really came from my experience, my journey of looking into Iran now as a newly transformed country, where before, as you remember, the women or the people of Iran were very modern, or the choice of religion was, it was something that it was very democratic, that you either were religious or you're not, and that no one was forced to wear the veil. And now when I went back, I always felt like it was almost like a communist country. Everything was coded, everything was controlled, including how the women were dressed, but also the way the cities looked. It was almost like the color was lifted off the ground. So my Woman of Allah developed from this curiosity, a very personal curiosity, of this transformation from Iran or the Persian culture to the Islamic Republic of Iran, are more central the role the woman played in this identity politics. For example, how to this date the government of Iran would not release or let go of the idea of the hijab, because the minute the woman let go of the hijab or unveiled, they are taken, their identity as Islamic regime is taken away. So by no means are willing to compromise. Where during the Reza Shah in the 1940s, where he was encouraging a more modern, cosmopolitan, Western life for Iranian people, he was forcing women to unveil, and many people, including my grandmother, didn't leave their home for days, for months, because they didn't want to be seen that way. So I found it of an immediate curiosity how that every time there is a political ideological change in the country, those mandates, those new rules are embodied in the women's, not just their bodies, but in their public lives. And then to go further, I went to investigate the subject of martyrdom and how certain women participated in this move toward obsession with death and their relationship to martyrdom. And I think, as you said rightfully, to this day, the one thing that the government seems to be still battling with today is the women and their refusal to submit majority to the hijab and to give them the freedom to have that identity that they want. And so Iranian women have become the biggest threat to the order of this government, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about how the Fury came about?
Yes, I mean, I have been very interested in how women are perpetually sexually assaulted and never talk about it, and how women from different corners of the world, we learn to be quiet and we learn not to report on it, because much of the time we feel like it's our fault. Yes. And I know as a child, when in our family there was anyone who sexually molested the children of the family, we would never mention, because they were always told to us that you're wrong, you're making. So this exists in general. But I think with the Fury, the video, I'm more interested in sexual assault by those who are in uniform, by the people of power, and the punishment, particularly of political prisoners, through rape and sexual assault. Because this is the best way to break people, whether they're young men or women who are in prison. This government, this religious government, actually has learned to perpetually rape. And once these individuals are raped, they're dismantled, and this trauma becomes almost impossible to recover from. And I've spoken to many people who were in prison and have seen and known people who have been raped and sexually assaulted. And I've also obsessively followed the trial of a prosecutor and seen the report of the families of those who were killed or raped. And
you mean in Iran?
Well, actually, Hamid Nouri is one of the famous, notorious prosecutor who's been captured in Sweden.
Yeah.
So the trial was in Sweden. And what's interesting, and even during the Women Life Freedom Revolution happened, is that many of these young men and women who were raped, even when they were freed, they commit suicide. So even though for many years now, I have not chosen to make any work that comes even close to being directly political, I couldn't help but wanted to make a work that in a highly fictionalized and surreal, stylized way captures this experience of a mental illness, the mental state of a woman who is bruised not due to natural causes, but by external forces, in this case, sexual assault and rape, where she no longer can cope with reality as we know it. Mm-hmm. And everything to her eyes and her view is something else. And so she's overwhelmed with the memories of what has haunted her. So even in the state of freedom, she's not free. And furthermore, her presence as a woman that is traumatized and bruised and devastated has this effect on others who, although are not Iranian, although they don't speak her language, they don't have the same religion, have no idea in her background, that they're affected, and their fury is created in the result of seeing her being assaulted.
Yeah.
Which is ironic, because this work was made in June of 2022, before the Women Life Freedom, and that's exactly what happened with Mahsa Amini when she was captured and killed, and that unleashed other people's rage and protest. So there's this sense of solidarity, humanity, and the human nature that when we see someone in pain, we feel their pain.
Yeah.
It's a common pain.
Yeah.
And we are reminded of our own pain.
But you didn't kind of anchor this in a sort of Middle Eastern environment. You chose to anchor it and use actors and participants who were basically New Yorkers. I mean, and it was shot in the streets of Brooklyn, in other locales in Brooklyn. Why did you sort of not make, the participants look like women of Iran?
For two reasons. First of all, I think the subject of sexual assault is universal, and I really feel that it's really not fair to reduce it to Iran. For example, if you look at Ukraine, the women of Ukraine are being raped by Russian soldiers, or you look at many different authoritarian societies where rape is constantly used in Africa, for example, in Sudan, to break people, to destroy them. But the other thing is that I am a nomadic artist. I have lived outside of Iran longer than in Iran. So the point is that I can never speak truth to anything. Everything I make goes as far away from documentary or anything that is specifically related to Iran, that I knew that I could, as long as I'm Iranian and I bring the baggage of being Iranian and what it's like to be an Iranian woman and raised in a country such as Islamic Republic of Iran, what it's like, but at the same time I didn't want to reduce the subject to only Iranian women.
And I mean, you've treated the subject obviously not literally. I mean, it's a very kind of poetic evocation. Yes. We don't see a woman being sexually assaulted. We don't see violence being exercised against a woman. We see a young woman who is even dancing at certain moments. She seems to be in a kind of state of abandon, and she does seem a little bit absent. She does seem like perhaps she does suffer from mental illness, but it's not a literal kind of, as you say, it's not a work of documentary.
Yes, I mean, this is something opposite to some other artists who do politically charged work. I draw a line between activism and art. I think that, you know, I always say when you're an activist, you distinguish between the good and evil, right and wrong. But when you make art, it's best to leave it to the audience to draw their own interpretation. Mm-hmm. And my interest in this piece was really to focus on the range of emotions, be a victim, to be trapped, to be the rage, the joy of dance, the desire, the eroticism, yet the disturbance of watching a woman circled by a group of men in power, the sense of powerlessness. So this film is really not as simple as to pointing fingers, which is obvious. We're all against any people of power who abuse, but really the mental, the psychological, the emotional condition of a woman who has to cope and has been dismantled, basically. Mm-hmm. Even when at the beginning of the film, when she goes out, she dresses almost like a prostitute, like she mm-hmm. can't even distinguish between what is the right or the wrong code. So I want the audience to see the work and experience it in a very guttural way, and not just on a rational way. And I think that is too much to ask from a lot of people, because many people prefer that you do take the side. You do really point which side you're standing on. Just like a woman of Allah, mm-hmm. people were disturbed because they thought that I was too neutral. But that's in general my opinion, that an art, to be powerful, it has to be left to the audience to draw their sure. meanings.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, as a person and an artist, you've always had a kind of dual identity. Even growing up as a little girl, you were from a very secular, progressive family. Your father was a physician, and but you lived in a very religious city, Qazvin. And so at home, you would have extraordinarily sort of westernized lifestyle. The whole style and fashion of your home was quite westernized. And then you'd go out in the street and there would be great religious devotion, and women in some areas, well, in most areas, who were veiled from top to toe. And so, I mean, you've talked about how there was always this sort of duality within you just growing up. And then now there is this duality between you, woman of Iran, living in New York, living in the West. And I just wonder, how much does this dual identity define your work? And I also wonder, what if the revolution hadn't happened and you had stayed in Iran? Yeah.
You really put your finger on something that is the very core of my work. Is really truly a manifestation of who I am. And as you explained, I'm a person that at a young age was always conflicted between a tendency to be very religious. I was very drawn to the mosque, so I was praying every day, the chanting, the Quranic chant, and yet at home, people drinking and playing cards, and I was always very conflicted and feeling guilty that in the school, at streets, the life was very different. And it's exactly how Iran was at the time. We had this divide between certain people who were moving toward the European Western life, those who were going back toward Islamic, fundamentalist life. And when I came to the US, I continued to be very divided between being Iranian and yet Western. And today in my work, I see that everything is centered around some form of opposites. I make black and white work. I'm focusing on magic realism, surrealism. I often work in dreams. I don't do very well with reality, or I'm always better, more like a poet. Things that don't make sense, things that are just out there. So I feel that it's a little bit also to do with me, that in my own character, I am someone who's very strong and really together, and yet I'm quite mad, and I'm very insecure and very fragile and very vulnerable. So I think my whole constitution from the young, as a young child to now is the same. It's like there's all kinds of divides. Mm-hmm. And if you really look at my work, both visually and conceptually, is equally in that way. Mm-hmm. That I never see anything as a whole.
But I also wonder whether you carry within you still this duality between this religious and devout side of you, because you describe going to the mosque and describe, reciting the Quran. Do you still have that duality between your religious side and your very secular Western side?
See, I always feel like religion is always been a great tool to help people, especially through hard time. I lived alone without my family for 11 years, which were the most difficult passage of my life. And so I know that there are moments that I'm very low and I need something. And I can understand then that for many, many people who have suffered from one reason or another, religion is of a great backing, is a great foundation. So I don't mind people who have a strong faith, and I never stand against that idea. Mm-hmm. And therefore, in Iran, I respect any person who gravitates toward religion. I just don't believe in fanaticism or any idea that someone decides for anyone else how to behave, how to live. This is fundamentally something I'm against. Mm-hmm. But am I personally a religious person? I think internally, yes, I'm always looking for something to believe in to help me navigate life. But it's a deeply personal one. It's not an organized religion as we know it.
Iran and the reality of being an Iranian woman is also very much at the heart of your work. I mean, regardless of what it is that you're making, you bring a certain Persianness, a certain Iranianness to what you do. And I think that we can't help it, as women of Iran. But I just wondered, what would you say if somebody said, you can take Shirin out of Iran, but you can't take Iran out of Shirin?
It took me a very, very long time to give myself that freedom to say that to myself, that you can take me out of Iran, but you cannot take Iran out of me. Because I always was scared to embrace narratives and ideas that don't relate to Iran, thinking that, oh no, I can only make work once it involves Iranian women, Iranian society. I went to Morocco, make women without men, until Land of Dreams, when I made a work about the US, but the main protagonist was Iranian. But that work was really a critique of American society, really it was. Yeah. And this piece, The Fury, in some ways it does go back to the Iranian society, of course, abuse of women in prison, but it really is truly an international subject, and the rise of fascism, and it really speaks about something that goes above and beyond Iran. But the story is told from the perspective of someone who is born into Iran and is still continues to be hugely engaged in the Iranian culture, even though she no longer stays there, is even visiting there. So I think that as artists are beginning to migrate and move, they can't help but their stories begin to be more international. But what still remains very authentic about them is where they come from. But their menu is becoming larger. And this would have been vastly different if I still continued to live in Iran. Like your question was, if the revolution hadn't happened, if I had become an artist, I would have been a very different artist. But the fact that I was in exile, the fact that I was separated from family and I suffered for so many years, and what I experienced in distance, all of this culminated in creation of work that it came due to all those experiences. But I have arrived, Farah, to a place that I don't think I could ever make art about Iran that is purely Iranian. And I think many of my Iranian friends won't really understand that and will still see my work through the lens of Iranian culture. And I have to ask them to stop. And that is something that gets me in trouble a lot, because no matter how far away I go to embracing the world, they want to bring me back to something that was a long time ago, that is much closer to the Iranian culture. And I think in some ways it would be really incorrect if I, after all these years that I haven't been to Iran, I still claim to make work about Iran explicitly, because I'm too far for too long from Iran.